At last. I was on vacation, the kind that exists only in confirmation emails and polite promises. Not in real life. My phone lay face down, unusually silent, while I allowed myself to sit still without checking for emergencies. That small pocket of quiet was when it happened. The vibration came sharp and insistent, like an accusation. I flipped the phone over and saw Gregory Hale's name. By the time I answered, his tone had already decided the outcome. "You missed my call," he said. No greeting, no context. That tells me everything I need to know. I stood there listening as the CEO of the company I had protected for years reduced my career to a single unanswered ring. He called it a commitment issue. He said leadership meant constant availability. He said people who disappear, even briefly, couldn't be trusted. Then, with bureaucratic efficiency, he informed me that my role was terminated effective immediately. I didn't interrupt. I didn't defend myself. Silence felt heavier than protest, and far more honest. I was Amara Flynn, Director of Risk Management. I was the person executives forgot to name until something went wrong. I translated impulsive decisions into insurable language, absorbed regulatory pressure, and kept Gregory's confidence intact during moments that could have ended him. I worked in margins and footnotes so the company could look fearless. Gregory despised that kind of power. He preferred authority that answered directly to him. He loved urgency, hated restraint, and distrusted anyone who didn't perform loyalty on demand. Control was his oxygen. "Say something," he finally snapped. "Do you understand what I'm saying?" "Yes," I replied. One word, calm, final. The call ended abruptly. No thanks. No acknowledgement of the years I had spent keeping his name off uncomfortable documents. Almost immediately, messages stopped before they started. No colleague reached out. No executive intervened. When risk works, no one notices it. When it's removed, they assume nothing will change. The air felt thinner, not dramatic, just strained, as if patience itself had finally been asked to carry too much weight. I lowered the phone, my chest tight but my posture steady, and let the reality settle without spectacle. Then I turned to the man sitting beside me on that long-delayed vacation, the one who had heard every word without reacting. He met my eyes, unbothered, and said quietly, "He just made my job very simple. How are you holding up right now? Did that moment hit a little closer to home than you expected? If the weather's cold where you are, try turning on a warm lamp or wrapping yourself in a blanket for a minute. Just enough to let the noise fade and your thoughts settle. I'd love to know where you're listening from tonight, and if this story already feels familiar. Consider subscribing because what happens next is where the quiet consequences begin." The silence after Gregory's call didn't feel empty. It felt crowded, filled with memories he had never bothered to learn. That quiet space pulled me backward, through years where my work lived in margins and meeting appendices. Never on slides. I had built the company's risk framework from scratch, piece by piece. After its first near collapse, when supply chains froze, when regulators circled, when investors started asking the wrong questions, I was the one who translated panic into procedure. I didn't stop disasters by shouting. I stopped them by anticipating how people failed under pressure and designing systems that absorbed those failures quietly. Most executives never noticed. Gregory noticed only when something threatened his authority. To him, risk was paperwork, something to delegate and forget until it became useful as a shield. When the board demanded answers, he pointed to my reports. When insurers asked for accountability, my signature was already there. I was the one who spoke to the D&O underwriters, who explained why this company deserved protection when others did not. Gregory never joined those calls. He disliked rooms where he couldn't dominate the tone. He preferred commands to conversations and treated caution like weakness. He loved decisions that sounded bold and hated the people who slowed him down long enough to keep him safe. Every time a crisis passed without consequence, he took credit. Every time risk was contained. He called it luck, timing, or momentum. There were meetings I learned about only after decisions were finalized. Strategy sessions where my name was absent. Even though my work would carry the liability, I would receive summaries instead of invitations, instructions instead of questions. Then, when the consequences surfaced, Gregory would step aside and let my analysis absorb the impact. I became the buffer between his confidence and reality. Visible only when blame needed direction. The bitterness didn't arrive all at once. It accumulated. Each time I was excluded. Each time my warnings were reframed as obstacles. Each time Gregory smiled at the board while standing behind the safety I had built. Loyalty, I realized, only flowed upward, never back to those who carried its weight. Trust, once given, was never returned. As I sat there, replaying those moments, another memory surfaced, sharper than the rest, during a renewal negotiation. I had insisted on adding a clause to our D&O policy, one triggered by material leadership changes involving risk oversight. The underwriter hesitated. Gregory waved it off without reading. Eager to move on, I didn't argue. I just waited until the clause was included. At the time, it felt procedural. Sitting there now, it felt inevitable. Gregory had never read it. He never read anything that assumed consequences might exist. That omission would soon matter more than any call I had missed, and I knew exactly why. He always ignored the quiet parts. The man sitting beside me on that long-delayed vacation hadn't reacted when Gregory raised his voice. He hadn't flinched when my career ended mid-sentence. Martin Cole rarely reacted quickly to anything. As underwriting director, his job was to listen, observe, and decide when patterns crossed lines that couldn't be uncrossed. We hadn't planned this meeting. We hadn't planned anything at all. That was the point. Independence mattered. I had spent years explaining risk in hypothetical language. Martin lived in outcomes. He knew the difference. I didn't tell him what happened. I didn't need to. He had heard enough. Silence wasn't avoidance. It was alignment. When systems work, they don't require commentary. Later that evening, while the air cooled and the noise of the day softened into something distant, I watched Martin open his laptop. No urgency, no performance, just methodical motion. He typed, reviewed, paused, then typed again. One email, one line. Material change confirmed. He didn't ask for my input. He didn't request documentation. Those already existed. My termination had supplied what the process required. Facts, not emotion. I didn't feel victorious. I felt precise. Gregory had mistaken quiet for weakness and availability for control. He believed consequences arrived loudly. Most don't. They arrive signed, time-stamped, and irreversible. I stayed where I was. Phone untouched. Posture steady. Letting the shift complete itself without interference. I had spent my career designing safeguards meant to activate when judgment failed. This time, I didn't need to trigger anything. I simply let the mechanism do what it was built to do. Understanding that changed my posture from reaction to observation. I wasn't retreating or advancing. I was standing exactly where leverage waits. Patient, documented, and indifferent to noise. Knowing the next movement would not require my voice at all times now. The first sign wasn't a phone call or a headline. It was a notification routed through the board's secure channel. The kind reserved for issues no one wants to explain out loud. The company's D&O insurance carrier had initiated a review, not an audit, not a renewal, a reassessment triggered by leadership change. I wasn't in the room, but I didn't need to be. I knew exactly how that message would land. Reviews like that don't ask questions. They imply them. And implication is where panic begins. Gregory reacted the way he always did when control slipped. He called legal first, then finance, then insurance, stacking urgency on top of silence. His messages went unanswered. Underwriters don't rush to reassure executives who create volatility. They wait. Waiting is leverage. Inside the company, tension spread quickly. Meetings stalled. Decisions were postponed. Anything that required a signature suddenly carried weight it didn't have the day before. Gregory paced, demanded updates, issued orders that went nowhere. Authority only works when someone is listening. Nathan Brooks, the general counsel, finally slowed the process down enough to read. He pulled the policy files, the correspondence, the disclosures submitted over the years. That was when the structure revealed itself. The risk narrative wasn't authored by the CEO. It never had been. My name appeared again and again, attached to explanations, mitigations, rationales insurers had accepted because they were consistent and documented. Nathan didn't announce it. He asked a careful question instead. Who had certified these disclosures? The answer was inconvenient. I had. Gregory hadn't even been copied. The realization tightened the room. Gregory's confidence shifted into something brittle. He insisted his authority superseded forms, that his signature should carry final weight. Nathan didn't argue. He just pointed to the clauses Gregory had approved without reading. Coverage depended on continuity of oversight. Oversight Gregory had just eliminated. Calls went out again. This time quieter. Insurance counsel. External advisors. No one contradicted the paper trail. Titles didn't matter there. Signatures did. Gregory finally saw it. His name was present, but ornamental. His signature sat on executive acknowledgments, not on the risk certifications that sustained coverage. He had power in meetings, not in mechanisms. The system didn't recognize volume or insistence. It recognized responsibility. I learned about all of this indirectly, through fragments and pauses, through the sudden absence of certainty in places that once sounded assured. The logic closed in without spectacle. No accusations, no speeches, just documentation aligning with consequence. By the time Gregory understood, his signature wasn't enough. The review was already moving forward, and systems, once engaged, do not reverse themselves. There was no anger in it, only the steady pressure of process doing exactly what it had always promised to do quietly. From here, the story begins to change direction. By the time the emergency board meeting was called, the tone had already shifted. Urgency replaced confidence, and certainty gave way to controlled unease. I wasn't invited. But my absence sat at the center of the table anyway. Elaine Porter opened the meeting without pleasantries. She asked one question, calmly and precisely, and it cut through the noise. Why had the company triggered a D&O review within hours of a termination? No one answered immediately. Silence filled the gap where leadership usually performed. Gregory spoke next. He always did. He framed the situation as a misunderstanding, then as an overreaction, then finally as sabotage. He used my name carefully, like a contaminated object, a disgruntled former employee. He said, someone acting emotionally after being held accountable. He suggested I had withheld information out of spite. No one nodded. The legal counsel clarified timelines instead. Facts replaced accusation. The termination, the trigger, the review. Each step aligned cleanly. Without commentary, Gregory's version began to sound theatrical by comparison. Then Martin Cole joined the call. He didn't raise his voice or assert authority. He stated outcomes. Terminating the company's risk certifying officer without transition constituted a high-risk leadership event. It required reassessment under policy guidelines. That assessment was already underway. This was not discretionary. Gregory interrupted. Insisting intent mattered. Martin corrected him. Outcome mattered. The room adjusted again. Control slipped away from emotion and settled into process. That was when Elaine asked if I would be willing to assist with clarification, to expedite resolution and reassure stakeholders. The question was framed politely, almost generously. I declined, not dramatically, not defensively. I said no because participation implied obligation, and obligation was no longer mine. The system didn't need interpretation. It had documentation. Gregory reacted immediately. He accused me of obstruction, of abandoning responsibility. He called my silence unprofessional. He demanded cooperation. Martin responded before anyone else could. Her silence is not negligence. Yours is. The words landed without emphasis. No follow-up, no elaboration, just a conclusion delivered in plain language. I understood then that leverage wasn't loud or fast. It waited for mistakes to document themselves. For impatience to expose structure. Gregory believed power moved by command. I knew it moved by permission, withdrawal, and timing, none of which required me to speak or explain consequences already in motion. I felt nothing surge or snap. I felt alignment. Control doesn't require visibility. Advantage doesn't announce itself. It settles quietly when the rules are followed exactly as written. The meeting ended without resolution, which was itself resolution enough. I remained where I was, untouched by urgency, letting the structure hold. I had spent years ensuring the system would function without me. Watching it do so now felt less like victory and more like confirmation that I had built something honest. The pressure escalated quickly, not through shouting, but through resistance. Gregory shifted from denial to attack, and his first move was legal. He announced, loudly, that he would pursue action against me for damages, interference, defamation. Whatever label sounded intimidating enough to regain momentum, she created this chaos. He insisted, she will answer for it. When that failed to steady the room, he turned outward. Gregory demanded the board issue a statement to calm investors. Something decisive and reassuring. He framed it as leadership. Elaine Porter framed it as liability. The difference mattered. Phones lit up. Drafts circulated and died unfinished. No one wanted to be the name attached to certainty. The insurance carrier had moved faster than Gregory expected. A formal notice arrived, brief and precise, stating that D&O protection for the chief executive was suspended pending review. Not canceled. Suspended. The distinction changed everything. Gregory's voice sharpened. That's impossible, he said. I'm the CEO. Titles didn't interrupt process. The room knew it. Silence followed his objections, the kind that signals consensus without comfort. With coverage paused. Authority became theoretical. Contracts requiring executive sign-off stalled. Strategic approvals froze. Even routine authorizations sat untouched, waiting for protection no longer guaranteed. The company slowed, not by protest, but by caution. Gregory pushed harder. He accused the board of cowardice. He demanded loyalty. You're letting her dismantle us. He said. No one answered. There was nothing left to argue. I remained outside the building, outside the meetings, yet present in every hesitation. The system didn't need my presence to apply pressure. It applied itself. Each unanswered email tightened the perimeter. Each unsigned document narrowed Gregory's options. The tension peaked when one board member declined the emergency session outright. No explanation beyond a single sentence delivered through counsel. He would not participate in decisions while personally uninsured. That sentence traveled faster than any threat Gregory had issued. The struggle ended without ceremony. No dramatic votes. No raised voices. Just recognition that risk had shifted hands. I felt the pull of it even at a distance. The moment when resistance turns inward and power exhausts itself. Execution isn't explosive. It's controlled erosion. Gregory fought until the structure refused to move for him. And when it stopped, there was nothing left for him to strike. I understood then that escalation was his only language, and it no longer worked. Every threat weakened him. Every demand exposed fear. He wasn't fighting me anymore. He was fighting the absence of protection. Systems don't argue, they wait. And in that waiting, authority collapses under its own weight. Quietly, precisely, exactly as designed. It was never personal, just inevitable. And once I saw that clearly, the struggle lost all meaning for him entirely in the end. The next part may change the way you view the whole story. I learned about the collapse the way these things usually surface. Indirectly and too late for correction. A message leaked from an analyst call. Then another from an internal memo forwarded where it didn't belong. The company's leadership insurance had been suspended. Not rumored. Not speculated. Confirmed. Once that line escaped containment, Everything accelerated. Partners requested contract reviews within hours. Clauses that had slept quietly for years suddenly woke up, blinking and sharp. Risk committees asked whether obligations still held without executive coverage. No one accused. They simply asked to pause. Gregory responded with urgency that bordered on desperation. He pushed for a press conference. Convinced that visibility could overpower uncertainty, he drafted statements about resilience, continuity, confidence. He wanted cameras, sound bites, something loud enough to drown out the paperwork. The board stopped him. Elaine Porter made the call before Gregory finished rehearsing. There would be no public remarks until the insurance review concluded. Anything else would increase exposure, Gregory argued. He framed silence as weakness, delay as surrender. Elaine didn't flinch. She had learned the difference between noise and damage inside the company. Paralysis set in. Executives hesitated to approve expenditures. Senior managers postponed decisions that carried even theoretical liability. Authority without protection felt suddenly reckless. Every move became a potential personal risk. Gregory tried to outrun it. He emailed reassurances, scheduled meetings, demanded alignment. Each message revealed more anxiety. Control fractured under scrutiny. The harder he pushed, the more resistance he created. I watched the pattern unfold without satisfaction. Only recognition. This wasn't sabotage. It was exposure. Gregory had spent years dismissing caution as pessimism. Now the absence of caution defined him. The breaking point came quietly. Elaine circulated an agenda update for the next board session. A single added item framed in neutral language. Assessment of current leadership risk. No adjectives, no conclusions, just a vote. That was when panic turned inward. Gregory lobbied privately, appealed emotionally, promised reform. He didn't notice that persuasion had replaced command. The shift was complete. I felt the collapse not as chaos, but as inevitability. Systems fail dramatically only in movies. In reality, they unravel through self-inflicted motion, each decision compounding the last. Gregory hadn't been undone by enemies or conspiracies. He had created conditions where trust withdrew and process stepped forward. By the time the vote occurred, the outcome was already present. The company hadn't lost insurance. It had lost confidence in the person who made insurance necessary. From the outside, it would later look sudden, but inside the collapse had been slow, procedural, and entirely self-authored. A series of small dismissals adding up to one irreversible consequence no statement could ever soften or credibly explain away. Gregory asked to see me after the vote was scheduled, but before it was held. A narrow window where desperation still pretends to be negotiation. We met in a small conference room off the main floor. Chosen for privacy rather than comfort. He looked smaller than I remembered. Not physically, but structurally, like a frame that had lost its load-bearing walls. He didn't start with anger. That phase had passed. He started with urgency, shaped to sound reasonable. He said the insurers were asking questions that only I could answer. He said a few clarifications would calm them. He said the board needed reassurance, and I owed the company that much. I listened without interrupting. There was a practiced humility in his voice, the kind executives use when they believe cooperation is still available. He avoided the word apology. Instead, he offered proximity, a return to relevance if I helped him contain the fallout. Just explain what you did. He said, "They trust you. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't lean forward. I spoke exactly once. You fired the buffer. Now face the impact." The words landed harder than anything louder could have. Gregory blinked, then frowned, as if searching for a counterargument that required force. He tried again, this time sharper, accusing me of hiding behind procedure, of letting personal grievance damage the company. He said leadership meant stepping in when systems failed. "That's the point," I replied. "They didn't fail." Silence settled between us, heavy and instructive. For the first time, he seemed to understand that nothing was being done to him. Nothing had been triggered by emotion or revenge. The process was already running. Indifferent to his intentions. My involvement was no longer required. He asked then, directly, what it would take for me to intervene. A statement? A call? A signature? Something to stop the slide. His voice cracked slightly on the last word. I shook my head, not in defiance, but in fact, there was nothing left to negotiate. That was the moment it reached him. Not as fear, but as clarity. He saw that I wasn't withholding power. I simply no longer held it. The leverage had moved into documentation. Timelines, clauses he had never read. I couldn't stop what I hadn't started. Gregory sat back, staring at the table, understanding finally that the outcome didn't depend on persuasion. I didn't need to win. The system had already decided. I stood, thanked him for his time, and left him there with the realization that silence, once dismissed as weakness, had become the most decisive force in the room. I walked away knowing I hadn't outmaneuvered him. I had outlasted the need to. That understanding settled slowly, irreversible, precise, and beyond his reach. The decision came quietly, without applause or outrage, delivered in a closed session that lasted less than an hour. When it ended, Gregory Hale was no longer the chief executive of the company he believed he commanded. The board framed it as a resignation, mutual and orderly, but no one pretended it was voluntary. The explanation reached the public later that afternoon. Reporters described it as a self-inflicted collapse, a phrase repeated so often it hardened into consensus. Analysts cited governance failure, insurance exposure, unchecked authority. No one mentioned my name. They didn't need to. The story wrote itself once the structure gave way. Inside the company, the shift felt immediate. Decisions resumed, signatures returned, conversations lost their edge. Removing Gregory didn't fix everything, but it restored predictability. And predictability is what institutions require to function. Order reasserted itself the moment uncertainty left the room. I received the call the next morning. Elaine Porter spoke carefully. The way people do when offering something they assume you want. The board would like me to return, she said. Not to my old position, but higher, expanded authority, direct reporting, and acknowledgement. Finally, of the work I had done quietly for years. I listened, not out of hope, but out of courtesy. The offer was generous, corrective, and late. Accepting it would have meant stepping back into a structure that had already shown me its limits. Gregory was gone, but the habits that enabled him remained. Softened, perhaps, but intact. I declined. Elaine paused, surprised but composed. She asked if the terms could be adjusted. More compensation, more autonomy, a public apology. I told her it wasn't about terms. It was about alignment. The company no longer needed me inside it. It needed the lesson more than the labor. I had done what I always did. Built something that worked without me. Returning would only blur the clarity of that outcome. After the call, I felt no triumph, only balance. Justice doesn't always feel like victory. Sometimes it feels like equilibrium restored after unnecessary strain. Gregory's departure closed a loop that had been tightening for years. I watched the coverage fade, replaced by new crises and new names. My story ended not with recognition, but with quiet completion. I hadn't stayed to be rewarded. I had stayed long enough to ensure the system corrected itself. That was enough. I moved forward without bitterness, carrying the certainty that order, once reclaimed, does not ask you to return to the place where it was lost. It wasn't a rejection born of pride, but of closure earned through restraint. I walked away knowing the imbalance had been corrected. Not in my favor, but in everyone's. That kind of ending doesn't demand applause. It stands on its own. Nothing more was required from me at all. I signed the new contract without ceremony, seated at a small table that overlooked nothing important. It wasn't an office with glass walls or assistants waiting outside. It was neutral, intentional, and finally honest. I was becoming an independent advisor to the insurance firm. Not an employee, not a shield, just a voice that documented risk and stepped away. The role suited me. I didn't need a title people recognized or authority that required permission. I needed distance, clarity, and the freedom to speak only when accuracy mattered. Consulting meant I no longer absorbed ambition for others. I observed, evaluated, and left systems better than I found them. The company moved on quickly. New leadership announced reforms, promised transparency, and thanked me publicly without inviting me back inside. That was fine. Order had returned. My presence was no longer required for it to hold. I noticed the change most in myself. My days slowed. Decisions felt cleaner. I no longer anticipated calls that never should have been mine to answer. Silence stopped feeling like risk and started feeling like proof that balance had been restored. People asked if I felt vindicated. I didn't. Vindication implies injury. What I felt was alignment. My work finally matched my values. I had stopped confusing loyalty with endurance and contribution with self-erasure. The insurance firm treated me differently than the company ever had. They asked questions and waited for answers. They respected boundaries because boundaries reduced risk. No one demanded availability. No one confused urgency with importance. That was the quiet victory. I didn't take anything from Gregory. I didn't need to. I simply stepped out of the path of someone who mistook protection for submission. Freedom arrived quietly, not as escape, but as precision. The relief of standing where responsibility ends and choice begins. Knowing my value no longer depended on sacrifice, speed, or silence, only on judgment exercised deliberately and the courage to remain unattached fully, looking back. I understood the truth clearly. Without bitterness or regret, I didn't miss a call. I just stopped protecting someone who didn't deserve it. What this story taught me isn't about revenge, power, or even winning. It's about understanding where your value truly lives. For years, I believed loyalty meant availability, that being indispensable required constant sacrifice. I thought silence was weakness, and stepping back meant losing ground. I was wrong. Real leverage doesn't shout. It documents. It waits. And it only works when you stop protecting people who refuse to respect the system you built. If you've ever been the person who held things together quietly, this moment probably felt familiar. Maybe you've been blamed for problems you prevented, or punished for boundaries you finally drew. If so, I hope this story reminds you that walking away isn't failure, it's alignment. Sometimes the bravest move is letting the structure reveal the truth on its own. I'd genuinely love to know, where are you listening from right now? Drop a comment and tell me what part of this story stayed with you the most. If it resonated, consider liking and sharing the video so it reaches someone who might need it tonight. And if you haven't subscribed yet, you're welcome to join us here. There are more stories ahead about quiet strength, earned justice, and the kind of endings that don't need applause to matter.